This photograph of Tiananmen is one of the most famous images of the 20th century. It was taken during the 1989 Tiananmen Massacre. But who was the Tiananmen? No one knows. For nearly 30 years, people have wondered what became of him. But his identity and his fate are still a mystery. This mystery lingers primarily because the rulers of China have made every effort to suppress the truth about what happened at Tiananmen. People in China today who dare to remember face brutal persecution. Just after the massacre, the Chinese government tried to use this photo as evidence that the military response to the student demonstrators have been restrained. The authorities praised the military actions and called the demonstrators thugs. But the world was not fooled. Part of the immediate power of this image was not just that it showed one man standing vulnerable in front of a column of tanks, but also that the whole world knew about events that had preceded this moment. The Tiananmen had so far survived a massacre, and yet here he was, still risking his life. I was a student protester in Tiananmen Square when the massacre began, late on the night of June 3rd. At one point, my friends and I were so close to the soldiers that we could shout up to them in their trucks and tell them not to shoot. We told them that they had no idea what was going on here, and we tried to touch their hearts by singing the songs that every Chinese would know. But when they received the order, they just opened the fire. I witnessed the many people killed, including the 11 students who were chased and run over by tanks. The Tiananmen photo was taken the next day, on June 5th, while the massacre was still going on. By any measure, this picture is an image of heroism. But how many heroes do we see here? Nearly 9 years after the photo was taken, the writer Picolaya said, "The heroes of a tank picture are two: the unknown figure who risked his life by standing in front of the juggernaut, and the tank driver who rose to the moral challenge by refusing to mow down his compatriot." Not only did the tank driver refuse to kill, he undoubtedly disobeyed orders and risked and perhaps received a punishment in the service of his countryman's life. He is an equal hero. I call him a tankman too. Victimized by the same evil force, these two heroic tankmen remind us that those who stand opposite us are not necessarily our enemies. Common sense, conscience, and humanity can prevail, even under brutal circumstances. I unfortunately lost the sight of the truth during a very extreme moment. After watching troops kill people on the early morning of June 4th, I saw a young soldier on Chang'an Avenue near Tiananmen Square, standing all by himself. He was not wearing a helmet, He didn't have a gun. He looked just like a teenager. The people I was with, who were sad and angry, chased him because he was a soldier. I gave him a punch, and more people gathered around him and beat him. When the crowd knocked him to the ground, he yelled, "I didn't do it. I didn't shoot." I realized a tragedy was taking place, but it was too late to stop the violence. I left the scene without looking back. A few minutes later, I knew from the loud shouts behind me, he had been killed. And I began to cry. Like all other soldiers, that teenager had been forced to come to Beijing to massacre protesting students and civilians. Like us, he was powerless to stop the tragedy. After conscience, he had probably refused to kill, choosing instead to be a deserter. If so, he was another tank man in the opposite camp. He is real hero, but I was not. I let anger get the better of me. I have seen my fellow students crushed beneath tanks. I had seen people whose only crime was calling for a democratic future, shot and killed just 3 feet away from me. So when I saw him only as my enemy, and I punched him. This might be the biggest sin of my life. I cannot imagine the pain he suffered when he was dying, or what was on his mind when he was being killed by his angry and frightened countrymen. For nearly 30 years, I have been mourning him. I think about his family, and I still look to a day when I find them and share my guilt. The Tiananmen tankmen taught me a lot. Heroic feats often happen in moments that go unnoticed. In June of 1989, the streets of Beijing witnessed many Chinese, like the tankmen, standing face to face with soldiers that are killing. And on those streets, there were also some soldiers, like the second tankman and like the deserter, who opposed the orders to kill. Remembering this, I'm convinced that no matter how difficult the road ahead of us, the direction of China's future must be towards democracy. The natural human desires for dignity and freedom that serve the foundation of all democratic movements are not only present in us, the freedom fighters. In every heart, there is goodness. That is where our hope comes from. And so, those who happen to be in our enemy's camp are not necessarily our enemies. We must overcome the existing enemy mentality that poisons our spirits, incites cruel mortal struggles, destroys our tolerance and humanity, and hinders our progress to a better society. Opposite us, there are always those who will refuse to betray their consciences. Any police or military officer, indeed anyone in the authoritarian state machinery, can be a hero if they are willing to raise their guns just an inch high when ordered to carry an act of suppression. Their names may be unknown, but they, like the two tank men, and like the teenager soldier, will be heroes of the historical process. I started by saying we still don't know who the tank man is or what happened to him. The same is true of the second tank man. And I don't think we should ever stop looking for any of them, because there are always tank men all around us. And if we know this, perhaps we might find it easier when the times calls for it to aspire to what is best in us, to look to our reserves of courage and compassion, and to try to be tank men ourselves. Thank you.